the barrel of the suppressed 45 Hong Kong dollars pressed firmly against the bridge of Elena's nose, the cold steel drawing a single drop of sweat that tracked down into her eye. Behind the glass of her dented hatchback, the world had gone silent, replaced by the rhythmic thumping of her own heart against her ribs. 3 men in charcoal tactical suits surrounded her car, their silhouettes blurring against the neon haze of the rain-slicked Chicago street. The man holding the weapon didn't blink. His eyes were twin voids of polished obsidian. Just 10 minutes ago, Elena had honked her horn and swerved to maintain her lane. Now she was staring into the mechanical eye of a reaper. This was the intersection of a mundane Tuesday and a lethal destiny. To understand how a public defender with a stack of pro bono files in her passenger seat ended up on her knees on the asphalt of Lower Wacker Drive, one must look at the black SUV she had dared to cut off. It wasn't a matter of road rage, it was a matter of survival. Some mistakes are etched in ink, others are forged in lead. This is the account of the woman who blocked the sun and found herself engulfed in the shadow of the Moretti crown. Elena's fingers white-knuckled the steering wheel, her knuckles appearing like ivory through the skin. She watched the rear door of the armored Cadillac Escalade swing open with a heavy, pressurized hiss. A pair of Italian leather loafers hit the wet pavement. Dante Moretti stepped out, adjusting the cuff of his bespoke suit as if he were arriving at a gala rather than an execution. He didn't look toward the gridlocked traffic or the blaring sirens in the distance. He walked straight toward Elena's window. "Roll it down," Dante said. His voice was a low, vibrating rasp that seemed to bypass her ears and rattle her spine. Elena's hand shook as she reached for the power switch. The glass slid down, inviting the smell of ozone and expensive cologne into the cramped cabin. Dante leaned down, his face inches from hers. He didn't scream. He didn't threaten. He simply reached in and picked up the file resting on her dashboard, the one marked State vs. Moretti, 1998. The air in the car thickened. Elena had spent 6 months digging into a cold case that the city had tried to bury under a mountain of hush money. She was the only person who knew that the man standing before her wasn't the legitimate businessman the papers claimed he was. She was the only one who had the forensic evidence linking his father to the disappearance of the district attorney. Dante flipped through the pages, his thumb pausing on a grainy photograph of a shallow grave. "You have a very brave way of choosing your enemies, counselor," Dante whispered. He handed the file back, but as he did, his fingers brushed hers. The contact was electric, a jolt of pure adrenaline that made her breath hitch. He turned to the man with the gun and gave a subtle, sharp tilt of his head. The weapon vanished back into the holster. "The light is green," Dante noted, gesturing to the signal above. "But your journey just became significantly more complicated." He turned on his heel and moved back toward the SUV. Elena watched him in the rearview mirror, her chest heaving as she tried to force air into her lungs. She shifted the car into drive, her foot trembling on the pedal. She didn't look back. She didn't stop until she reached her apartment, but as she fumbled with her keys at the front door, she noticed a small black transponder tucked into the handle of her briefcase. She stepped inside and slammed the door, locking all 3 bolts. The silence of her apartment felt like a trap. She moved to the window and peered through the blinds. Down on the street, parked directly under a flickering lamp, was the black SUV. It wasn't moving. It wasn't leaving. It was waiting. Elena grabbed her phone to call the police, but the screen was already dark, a single line of text scrolling across the black glass. "I'm already inside." Elena dropped the phone. It clattered against the hardwood, the sound echoing like a gunshot. She backed away from the door, her heels clicking rhythmically until she hit the kitchen counter. Her hands searched for the heavy cast-iron skillet, her fingers closing around the handle. The shadows in the hallway seemed to stretch, detaching themselves from the walls. A floorboard creaked, not near the door but from the bedroom. If you think the law can protect you from a man who owns the judges, hit the like button so Elena's story reaches the people who can truly hear the truth. The bedroom door creaked open. Dante Moretti stepped into the dim light of the kitchen, holding a glass of her wine. He looked at the skillet in her hand and a ghost of a smile touched his lips. "I prefer my chefs a bit more experienced, Elena," he said. He walked toward the table and sat down, gestured for her to join him. "We have exactly 40 minutes before my brother's men arrive to burn this building to the ground. You have the file. I have the exit strategy. Sit." Elena didn't sit. She gripped the skillet tighter, her breath coming in jagged bursts. "Why would your brother want to burn you down?" she asked. Dante took a sip of the wine, his eyes fixed on the door. "Because the file you're holding doesn't just implicate my father. It implicates the man who currently runs the syndicate. My brother. And he knows I'm the only one who can verify the signatures. A sudden sharp pop sounded from the hallway, the sound of a suppressed round taking out the porch light. Dante was on his feet in a second, his calm facade replaced by a predatory intensity. He grabbed Elena's wrist and pulled her toward the fire escape. The time for litigation is over, he hissed. Now we run. They scrambled down the metal stairs as the first smell of accelerant wafted through the floorboards. Below them the alley was a dark maw. Dante pushed her toward a motorcycle hidden under a tarp. He tossed her a helmet. Hold on tight, he commanded. As the engine roared to life, the fourth floor of the apartment building erupted in a violent blossom of orange flame. Elena wrapped her arms around Dante's waist, her face pressed against his back as they tore through the city, leaving her life, and the truth, behind in the ashes. The wind tore at Elena's clothes as the Ducati 1299 Panigale screamed through the industrial district. Dante leaned into the turns with a lethal grace, the city lights blurring into a continuous streak of neon. Behind them, the roar of a high-displacement engine signaled that the cleanup crew hadn't been deterred by the fire. Two black SUVs with reinforced grille guards were gaining ground, weaving through the late-night traffic with reckless disregard for life. Look for the bridge. Dante shouted over his shoulder. He took a sharp right, the bike skimming inches from a brick wall. Elena gripped him harder, her eyes squeezed shut until the bike leveled out. They were heading for the old iron drawbridge over the canal. The warning lights were already flashing red. The bridge was beginning to rise. Dante didn't slow down. He twisted the throttle, the engine's pitch rising to a frantic howl. Dante, stop. Elena screamed. He didn't answer. He tucked his head low and accelerated. The gap between the rising leaves of the bridge grew. They hit the incline at 80 miles per hour. For a heartbeat there was no sound, only the weightlessness of the abyss. They cleared the gap, the bike slamming onto the opposite side with a bone-jarring thud. The first SUV behind them attempted the jump. It lacked the velocity. The heavy vehicle clipped the edge of the rising steel, flipping end over end before plunging into the icy black water of the canal. The second vehicle screeched to a halt at the edge of the chasm. Dante slowed the bike and turned it around, the headlights illuminating the lone figure stepping out of the remaining SUV. It was a man who looked exactly like Dante, but with a jagged scar tracking from his ear to his jawline. Lorenzo Moretti. He didn't pull a gun. He simply stood at the edge of the bridge and raised a hand, two fingers extended. Dante's hand went to Elena's arm, his grip tightening. He's calling in the Reapers, Dante whispered. What are Reapers? Elena asked, her voice trembling. Dante turned the bike and headed toward the outskirts of the city. They aren't men. They're ghosts. Mercenaries who don't leave a footprint. If Lorenzo has authorized a full-scale hunt, there isn't a safe house in Illinois that will hold us. He steered the bike into a dense forest preserve, the trees closing in like the bars of a cage. They reached a small, dilapidated hunting cabin deep in the woods. Dante killed the lights and rolled the bike into a shed. He led Elena inside the cabin, the air smelling of pine needles and old gunpowder. He moved to the floorboards under the rug and pulled up a hidden crate. Inside were 2 assault rifles and a stack of encrypted hard drives. You need to give me the file, Dante said, his back turned to her. Elena clutched her briefcase. No. This is my leverage. It's the only reason I'm still alive. Dante turned around, his face illuminated by the pale moonlight. No, Elena. It's the reason you're a target. My brother doesn't want the evidence. He wants the witness. He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming the small room. If you stay with me, you're dead. If you give me the file and take the bike, you can disappear. Elena looked at the rifles, then at the man who had just risked his life to jump a drawbridge for her. She realized then that Dante wasn't trying to steal her evidence. He was trying to erase his own history. You're in the file too, aren't you? She asked. Dante froze. He reached out and gently took the briefcase from her hand. He didn't open it. He walked to the fireplace and threw it into the embers. Dante, no. Elena lunged for the fire, but he caught her around the waist. It's over, he whispered. The only copy is gone. You're no longer a witness. You're just a girl who got lost in the woods. A sudden rhythmic thudding began to vibrate the roof of the cabin, the sound of a low-altitude helicopter. The Reapers had arrived. Dante shoved a handgun into Elena's hand. Go to the cellar. Don't come out until the shooting stops. He didn't wait for her to respond. He kicked open the front door and stepped into the clearing, the moonlight catching the steel of his rifle as the first rappelling lines dropped from the sky. Elena huddled in the damp darkness of the cellar, the floorboards above her groaning under the weight of heavy boots. The air was filled with the staccato rhythm of gunfire and the muffled grunts of men in combat. She could hear Dante's voice, not shouting but barking commands with the icy precision of a man born to lead a war. Each explosion of sound made her flinch, her fingers aching from the grip she held on the pistol. Suddenly, a heavy thud sounded directly above her head, followed by the sound of glass shattering. The cellar door creaked. Elena raised the gun, her thumb fumbling with the safety. A shadow fell across the stairs. "Elena, it's me," Dante rasped. He stumbled down the steps, his shoulders soaked in a deep, dark crimson. He collapsed against a crate of wine, his breathing ragged. "You're hit," Elena whispered, moving toward him. She ripped a strip of cloth from her shirt and pressed it against the wound. Dante hissed in pain, his eyes clenching shut. "They have thermal imaging," he gasped. "The cabin is a death trap. We have to move through the drainage tunnels." He pointed to a small, rusted iron grate in the corner of the cellar. "If you believe that some secrets are worth more than the lives of those who keep them, hit the like button so this story finds those who know the price of silence." They crawled through the narrow, freezing tunnels for what felt like miles. The smell of raw earth and stagnant water filled Elena's lungs, making her head spin. Dante led the way, his movements becoming increasingly sluggish. Finally, they emerged into a ravine several miles away from the cabin. The dawn was beginning to break, casting a gray, sickly light over the forest. Dante slumped against a mossy rock, his face the color of parchment. "The bike is gone," he said, looking at his blood-stained hands. "The Reapers will be circling back. Lorenzo won't stop until he sees my body." Elena looked at him, then at the gun in her hand. She realized that for the last 6 hours she hadn't been a lawyer. She had been a fugitive. And the only person she could trust was a man who had just burned the evidence of his own crimes to save her. "Why?" she asked. "Why save me? You could have just let them take the car in the city." Dante looked up at her, a strange, hollow look in his eyes. "Because when you blocked my car you looked at me with more than fear. You looked at me with judgment. No one has judged me in 20 years, Elena. Everyone else just fears me." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small gold locket. He handed it to her. "Inside is the key to a vault in Switzerland. It's not money. It's the original signatures. My brother thinks I burned the only copy. He doesn't know about the vault." He coughed, a spray of red hitting the leaves. "Get to the city. Find a man named Marcus. Tell him the Reaper is calling in his debt." "I'm not leaving you," Elena said, her voice hardening. She stood up and pulled his arm over her shoulder. "You saved me from the fire. I'm saving you from the woods." They began to walk, a slow, agonizing trek toward the distant sound of a highway. Behind them, the forest was silent, but the air felt heavy as if the trees themselves were watching. They reached the edge of the forest just as a black SUV, identical to the one Dante had stepped out of, pulled onto the shoulder of the road. Elena froze, her hand going to the gun. The door opened. It wasn't Lorenzo. It was a man with white hair and a military posture. "Marcus. The Reaper sent us," the man said, stepping forward. He looked at Dante's wound and signaled to the paramedics in the back of the SUV. They moved with professional efficiency, loading Dante onto a stretcher. As they pulled away, Marcus turned to Elena. "You have the locket?" Elena nodded, her fingers closing tight around the gold. Marcus looked at her with a grim respect. "The city is going to change tonight, counselor. I hope you're ready for the fallout." Elena watched the SUV disappear into the morning mist. She was covered in mud, blood, and the ashes of her old life. She wasn't a lawyer anymore. She was the woman who had blocked a king and in doing so had started a revolution. 3 weeks later, the front page of every newspaper in the country carried the same headline: "The Moretti Empire Collapses." The evidence from the Swiss vault had been enough to dismantle the largest criminal organization in the Midwest. Lorenzo was in a maximum security facility, and the judges who had been on the payroll were being led away in handcuffs. Elena sat on a park bench, the sun warm on her face. She was wearing a new coat, bought with the modest relocation fund the FBI had provided. She looked at her hands, the calluses from the forest were still there, a permanent reminder of the night the world turned black. A shadow fell over her. She didn't look up. She knew the scent of the cologne. "The locket was a nice touch," Dante said, sitting down beside her. He looked different. His suit was gone, replaced by a simple sweater and jeans. His arm was in a sling, but his eyes were clear. "You're supposed to be in a witness protection program in Arizona?" Elena said, a small smile playing on her lips. Dante looked at the children playing near the fountain. I've never been very good at following the rules, Elena. You should know that by now. You're the one who blocked my car. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small folded piece of paper. He handed it to her. It was a business card. Moretti and Associates, Legal Consulting. I think I'm going to need a very good lawyer, he said. Someone who isn't afraid to stand in the middle of the road and tell a king to stop. Elena took the card, her fingers brushing his. This time the spark wasn't adrenaline. It was hope. She looked at the man who had burned his past to give her a future, and she realized that sometimes, the best way to move forward is to block the path behind you. Subscribe if you want to hear more stories about people who risked everything for the truth. The wind picked up, swirling the fallen leaves around their feet. Dante stood up and offered her his hand. Elena took it. As they walked away from the park, the black SUV parked across the street pulled away, disappearing into the flow of traffic. The shadow was gone. There was only the light. The light in the park was warm, but the silence between them was heavy with the ghosts of the people they used to be. Dante's hand was a steady anchor, but as they reached the edge of the sidewalk, a silver sedan with tinted windows pulled alongside the curb. Dante's posture shifted instantly, the casual relaxation vanished, replaced by the coiled tension of a man who had survived a dozen assassinations. The driver's window rolled down an inch, revealing a pair of eyes shielded by dark aviators. The vacuum is filling, Dante, the driver said, his voice a low monotone. Lorenzo is behind bars, but the families in the east are already moving on the docks. They think the Moretti name is dead. Dante didn't answer. He gripped Elena's hand tighter, pulling her slightly behind his shoulder. The driver tossed a small, encrypted burner phone onto the pavement. They're not looking for a businessman anymore. They're looking for the Reaper. You have 12 hours before the first hit team lands at O'Hare. Dante kicked the phone into the gutter without breaking eye contact with the driver. I'm out, he said, his voice like grinding stones. The window rolled up, and the sedan screeched away, leaving a plume of exhaust that tasted like burnt rubber and impending war. Elena looked at the phone in the gutter, then at the man beside her. She realized that the collapse she had read about in the papers was only a pruning. The roots of the syndicate were still deep and they were starving. You can't go back to your apartment, Dante said, his eyes scanning the rooftops across the street. The relocation fund isn't a shield, it's a tracking device. Every time you use that debit card, a ping goes to a server in Langley, and from there, it's sold to the highest bidder. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a set of keys to a vintage 1969 Mustang parked 2 blocks away. We need to get off the grid. Truly off. They drove through the night, heading toward the rural stretches of Indiana where the horizon was nothing but corn and sky. Elena watched the speedometer climb. The transition from public defender to an outlaw's shadow was complete. She felt the weight of the gold locket in her pocket, the physical proof that she had traded her law degree for a death warrant. If you think Elena's life was over the moment she tapped her horn that Tuesday morning, hit the like button so her story reaches those who know that one choice can change everything. They arrived at a small, abandoned grain silo that had been converted into a fortified bunker. The walls were reinforced with 3-inch steel plating, and the air inside smelled of lithium batteries and gun oil. Dante moved to a bank of monitors that flickered to life as he entered a complex sequence of codes. The screens showed thermal feeds of the surrounding fields. This is a black site, he explained, his fingers flying across the keys. Not even my brother knew about this one. It's where I kept the things I couldn't trust to the family. Like what? Elena asked, stepping toward a rack of heavy equipment. She saw rows of passports from 5 different countries, all with Dante's face but different names. Next to them was a crate of high-explosive breaching charges. Dante didn't look up. Like the truth about who actually killed the district attorney in '98. It wasn't my father. It was a man who currently sits on the Supreme Court. The revelation hit Elena like a physical blow. The victory she had celebrated in the papers was a distraction. They had taken down a Mafia boss, but they had left the architect of the corruption untouched. The man she had helped put in power was the very man who had authorized the hit on her predecessor. A sudden, sharp chirp came from the thermal monitors. A group of 4 heat signatures was moving through the cornfield, fanning out in a tactical pincer movement. They weren't using flashlights, they were using high-end night vision goggles. They found us, Dante whispered, reaching for a shotgun mounted under the desk. They didn't use the phone. They used the car's GPS. Dante handed Elena a pair of tactical headsets. Put these on. I'm going to vent the grain dust from the silos. It creates a combustible cloud. When I give the signal, you hit the ignition switch on the wall. Elena's hands were shaking so hard she could barely fit the headset over her ears. Dante, that will kill them all. It's them or us, Elena, he said, his eyes hardening into the void she had seen that first day in the SUV. There is no middle ground in a war against ghosts. He moved toward the heavy steel door, his shotgun leveled. The first sound of a suppressed rifle round sparked against the silo's exterior. If you believe that justice sometimes requires a fire that consumes the law, drop a like so the algorithm knows the story is for the brave. The grain dust began to hiss into the air, a fine golden powder that coated everything. Outside, the hit team was closing in, unaware they were stepping into a fuel-air bomb. Dante looked at Elena, his finger on the door release. Now, he commanded. Elena closed her eyes and slammed her palm onto the red ignition button. A muffled whump shook the entire structure, followed by a roar that sounded like the earth itself was screaming. Through the periscope, Elena saw a wall of orange fire roll across the cornfield, incinerating the shadows. The thermal monitors went white, blinded by the intensity of the blast. Dante didn't wait for the fire to die down. He grabbed a bag of gear and shoved Elena toward the back exit, a tunnel that led to an old well. They emerged into the cool night air, the smell of burnt grain and ozone thick in their lungs. Behind them, the silo was a towering torch against the black sky. Dante didn't look back. He led her toward an old farm truck hidden under a haystack. The Supreme Court Justice will be at his estate in Virginia tomorrow, Dante said, his voice cold and flat. He thinks the Reaper died in that silo. He's about to find out that the Reaper doesn't die. He just gets hungry. Elena looked at her reflection in the truck's side mirror. Her face was smeared with ash, her eyes hard and hollow. She wasn't the woman who stood in courtrooms anymore. She was the woman who pulled the trigger on a cornfield. She climbed into the truck, the gold locket heavy against her chest. Let's go to Virginia, she said. The revolution wasn't over. It was just getting started. The drive to Virginia was a descent into a different kind of darkness. The truck's cabin was a tomb of silence, broken only by the rhythmic clicking of the turn signal. Dante's face was a landscape of sharp shadows, illuminated by the green glow of the dashboard. He had spent the last 3 hours cleaning a signature .45 caliber handgun, his movements repetitive and mechanical, like a priest preparing for a grim ritual. The justice's estate is called the Gables, Dante said, his voice barely audible over the hum of the tires. It's protected by a private security firm made up of former Delta operators. They don't use sirens. They use silencers. And they won't arrest us. They'll just make us part of the landscaping. He reached into the glove box and pulled out a small black device with a single toggle switch. This is a wide-spectrum jammer. It'll give us 90 seconds of dead air on their comms. After that, we're on our own. Elena stared at the passing trees, her fingers tracing the cold metal of the locket. She realized she wasn't just a lawyer or a fugitive anymore. She was the final piece of a puzzle that had been missing for nearly 30 years. The man at the Gables wasn't just a corrupt official. He was the reason her father, a junior clerk in '98, had been found at the bottom of a river with his briefcase full of stones. The State versus Moretti file wasn't her career, it was her inheritance. I'm the one who enters the library, Elena said, her voice firm, startling Dante. He looked at her, the gun pausing mid-slide. No. You stay in the perimeter. I'm the blunt force. Elena shook her head, her jaw set. He knows your face, Dante. He's been expecting a Reaper for years. But he's never met a public defender with a locket full of his sins. He won't pull a gun on me immediately. He'll try to bribe me. And that's when you move. If you think Elena is the real weapon in this war, hit the like button so her father's story finally reaches the light. They reached the perimeter of the estate at 3 a.m. The Gables was a colonial-style fortress of white brick and black shutters, sitting at the end of a mile-long driveway lined with ancient oaks. Dante cut the engine and let the truck coast to a stop in the tall grass. He handed Elena a small earpiece. If I say red line, you run for the trees and don't look back. No matter what you hear. They moved through the woods like ghosts. Dante took out the first guard near the gatehouse with a single silent strike to the carotid, non-lethal but effective. He dragged the body into the brush while Elena moved toward the side entrance of the library. The windows were tall and narrow, glowing with a soft amber light. Inside, a man with silver hair sat behind a mahogany desk, reading a leather-bound book as if the world wasn't burning around him. Justice Arthur Sterling. Elena stepped out of the shadows and tapped on the glass. Sterling didn't flinch. He slowly closed his book, marked the page and looked up. He didn't look surprised, he looked bored. He gestured for her to enter through the French doors. Elena stepped inside, the plush carpet swallowing the sound of her muddy boots. The air smelled of old paper and expensive cognac. "The public defender," Sterling said, his voice a smooth, cultured baritone. "I must admit your persistence is quite impressive. Most people would have taken the relocation fund and bought a quiet life in Scottsdale." He leaned back, his hands steepled. "But you have your father's eyes. Stubborn. Unwise." He didn't understand the hierarchy of this city, and it seems you don't either. "I understand the hierarchy perfectly, Arthur," Elena said, her voice steady. She walked to the desk and laid the gold locket on the mahogany surface. It looked like a drop of blood against the dark wood. "The Morettis were just the muscle. You were the mind. You authorized the hit on the DA because he found out about the offshore accounts you were using to fund your seat on the bench." Sterling laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "And who will believe you? A fugitive lawyer who burned down a grain silo in Indiana? You're a terrorist in the eyes of the law, Elena. I am the law." He reached into his desk drawer, but before his hand could emerge, the light in the room flickered and died. The jammer was active. "Dante now!" Elena screamed. The French doors shattered inward as Dante burst through, his shotgun leveled at the man behind the desk. But he wasn't alone. 2 guards dropped from the balcony above, their suppressed submachine guns spitting fire. Dante dove behind a sofa, the fabric erupting in clouds of foam and dust. Elena didn't hide. She grabbed the locket from the desk and lunged for Sterling. He pulled a small derringer from the drawer, but Elena slammed the heavy mahogany chair into his arm, the gun firing into the floor. She tackled the old man, her fingers digging into his throat. "For my father," she hissed. "If you believe that no one, not even a judge, is above the truth, drop a like so this story finds its way to the top of the feed." The room was a chaos of muzzle flashes and breaking glass. Dante was a blur of violence, taking down the 2 guards with a combination of close-quarters combat and precise, deafening blasts from his shotgun. He reached the desk just as Sterling managed to throw Elena off him. Sterling scrambled for the fallen derringer, his face contorted in a mask of panicked rage. Dante stepped on Sterling's hand, the bone snapping with a sickening crunch. He didn't fire his weapon. He looked down at the man who had ordered his father's death and Elena's father's disappearance. "The Reaper is here, Arthur," Dante whispered. He pulled a small digital recorder from his pocket, the one Elena had been wearing under her shirt. And the jammer didn't just block the comms. It broadcasted this entire conversation to a secure server at the FBI. Sterling's face went white. The board mask was gone, replaced by the raw, shivering terror of a man who realized he had just confessed his life's crimes to a live audience. Outside, the distance echoed with the approaching wail of federal sirens. Dante reached down and offered a hand to Elena, pulling her up from the wreckage of the library. "Is it over?" she asked, her breathing coming in ragged gasps. Dante looked at the silver-haired man sobbing on the floor, then at the girl who had stood her ground against a king. He reached into her pocket and pulled out the locket, placing it back in her hand. "The trial is over, Elena. The execution is just beginning." They walked out of the library and into the cool Virginia night. The oak trees were silhouetted against the flashing red and blue lights of the federal task force swarming the estate. Dante didn't run. He stood at the edge of the lawn, his hand in Elena's as the world they had broken began to rebuild itself around them. Months later, Elena stood in a new office, one with a view of the Chicago skyline. The name on the door was simple: Elena Vance, attorney at law. There were no more Morettis, no more Reapers, and no more shadows. She picked up a small gold locket from her desk and smiled. It was empty now, the secrets inside used to heal a city. The phone on her desk rang. She picked it up. "Vance," she said. A low, vibrating rasp came through the line, one that made her heart skip a beat. "I'm at the intersection of Wacker and Michigan," the voice said. "And I think someone is blocking my car." Elena laughed, the sound bright and clear. She grabbed her coat and walked out the door, moving toward a future that was no longer written in blood, but in light.